Solo Leveling by Chu Gong. Chapter 67, The Inheritance. The 50,000 or so hunters from around the globe who had gathered to deal with the monolithic gate were flabbergasted to see the black magic beasts kneeling before Jin-Woo. Damn! The countless kneeling soldiers were either clad in black armor or cloaked in black smoke. Each possessed incredibly high magic power. But that wasn't what had the hunters in stunned disbelief. Are those? Back there! You see what I'm seeing, right? I definitely am. Blood drained from the hunters' faces as they pointed to the 3 dragons at the rear of the magic beast army. The dragons had also obediently lowered their heads, like pets healing before their master. The hunters were rendered speechless at the sight. Kamish was the one and only dragon to have appeared through a gate in human history, and it had killed numerous high-rank hunters and nearly bathed the entire planet in fire. There was a good reason people referred to it as the Undying Flame. Being faced with 3 such creatures was enough to drain the fight out of the hunters. What would have happened if the hunters had clashed with those magic beasts? Chills ran up the hunters' spines as they imagined how things could have played out. That further called into question the identity of Jin-Woo, who was standing there in front of the magic beasts as if it were a perfectly natural thing. Jin-Woo looked out at Bellion and the kneeling soldiers. So this is the real Shadow Army. Igris was right. He had notified Jin-Woo of this a couple of days ago. My lord, the Shadow Army has completed all of its preparations. Jin-Woo had needed some time to process that shocking announcement. He then found himself in a dilemma. Was there any way to explain to others the unbelievable tale of conflict between the monarchs and the rulers, as well as the truth about gates? There was no way he could convince this many people who had traveled from all over the world for the sole purpose of keeping the gate from turning into the greatest disaster ever. And in the 1 in a million chance that Igris was wrong, what then? So Jin-Woo had decided to wait for the gate to open and confirm things with his own eyes. And now here they were. Jin-Woo swallowed hard as he scanned the soldiers. Although he hadn't created these soldiers, he could feel his connection to each of them. It was a complex network, much like a spiderweb. Through it, he could feel how overjoyed they were to be reunited with their master. This is my inheritance from the previous Shadow Monarch. The soldiers silently swore their devotion to their new master. Jin-Woo's heart overflowed with as much emotion as theirs did. His gaze moved from the dragons bringing up the rear to Grand Marshal Bellion in the front of the army. Bellion possessed a commanding presence and strength well suited for his rank, and on his back were the scars of wings that had been torn off. 4 wings. Ordinary foot soldiers had 2 wings, while the rulers had 6. If that was any measure, he had a good idea of what an intrepid soldier Bellion was. He focused his perception and detected the Grand Marshal's extraordinary levels of mana that he had kept hidden out of deference for Jin-Woo. I knew it. Bellion was able to lead an army that included dragons in its ranks precisely because he was this powerful. The Shadow Army. The king itching for war had been reunited with his soldiers. Ba-dump, be-a-dump, be-a-dump. But this wasn't the extent of his army. In addition to those who had served under the previous Shadow Monarch Ashbourne, Jin-Woo had his own soldiers as well. Come out. His original Shadow Army silently materialized behind him at his call. Their numbers were nearly 2,000 strong. Baru, Igris, Greed, Number 6, Fawn, Iron, Jima, Tank, and the rest appeared behind Jin-Woo. Thump! They too bent at the knee and bowed their heads. Every single Shadow soldier silently swore their allegiance to him. Jin-Woo nodded in satisfaction. The once divided Shadow Army was complete. He finally had a force that was strong enough to go up against the monarch's armies. Everything was going smoothly. Well, almost everything. Jin-Woo looked over his shoulder. Tens of thousands of hunters and hundreds of reporters who had come to record the historic battle stared back at him. Everyone looked puzzled, unable to comprehend what was going on. Okay. Jin-Woo smiled awkwardly as he took in their blank expressions. How do I explain this? The world was turned upside down. The scene of the magic beasts pouring out from the massive gate and then dropping to their knees in front of Jin-Woo had been broadcasted live across the globe. Viewers were still reeling from the shock, and online communities exploded with heated discussions. WTF? What the hell is with those magic beasts? Anyone know what's going on? Could all those magic beasts be Hunter Sung's minions? Damn. I heard that at least 100k magic beasts came out of the gate. No way. How could minions come out of a gate? Stop trolling. Then feel free to explain what just happened. They look exactly the same as Hunter Sung's minions for sure. But how are minions coming out of a gate? Disbelief was the most common reaction, but there were other perspectives as well. Still, thank goodness they're not coming after us. Oh, for sure. If they did, we'd all be dead by now. I saw in an interview that 3 of the magic beasts were dragons. 3 dragons. LMAO. Absolutely insane. LMAO. LOL. Kamish would have taken one look and gone back inside its gate. Huh? What do you mean? Kamish has been dead for almost 9 years. Dang, ruining the punchline. I feel like I'm going insane. Really wish Hunter Sung would explain what's going on. TV networks replayed the footage again and again as they tried to analyze the situation, but no one could adequately explain how minions, which somehow included dragons, had come out of a gate instead of magic beasts. I'm not sure how. They could only silently shake their heads. Some experts were especially taken aback by the sight of more than 100,000 minions kneeling before Jin-Woo. No matter how you looked at it, these subjects were bowing to their master. Some people suggested Demon Lord as a nickname for Jin-Woo, which was fitting for someone so majestic that he was surrounded by soldiers in black. Other experts considered the incident to be nothing short of a miracle. It's been shocking to say the least, but this is a fortunate situation for us. Fortunate, you say? Look at the number of magic beasts, or rather minions. The expert pointed to the countless bowed heads of the Shadow Army pictured on a monitor. The host gulped when he tried to estimate their numbers, and found them impossible to count. Even without the 3 dragons, their numbers were excessive. If the hunters had to fight those minions, it wouldn't just be a matter of winning or losing. It would be a countdown to the complete and utter annihilation of humanity as they swept across the planet. The host unconsciously nodded, engrossed. That's why it's fortunate that they're Hunter Sung's minions and that he can control them. But that was just that expert's theory. Of course, only Hunter Jin-Woo Sung knows the truth, the expert concluded. As if on cue, the monitor played the most shocking moment of the entire length of footage. Right here, this part. After scanning the hunters, Jin-Woo sank into his own shadow and disappeared. The host shook his head and adjusted his glasses as he spoke. Hunter Sung is at the heart of all this confusion. But where is he now? The Hunters Association of Korea was bombarded with non-stop calls asking for details, but their official response was that they had no knowledge of Jin-Woo's whereabouts. Jin-Woo was a hot topic, and the association's response was inevitably fanning those flames. The host excitedly turned to the camera. We can only hope he comes back soon and answers some of these questions for us. Jin-Woo returned to the deserted forest in Japan, leaving the prying eyes behind. This large swath of land that seemed to go on for days was the best place to test his control of his shadow army. Jin-Woo stood at a distance from the 130,000 soldiers he had divided into two groups. Go! At Jin-Woo's telepathic order, the two units charged at each other. Thud, 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 thud. The sound of the soldiers stomping shook the land as the gap between the two units shrank in an instant and the soldiers clashed. Jin-Woo repositioned the soldiers who had strayed behind, making them sweep around to surround their opponents. He then sent other soldiers to places that needed reinforcements by recalling and then summoning them in the appropriate spot. The flow of the army was as fluid as the flow of water. He applied his own combat experience to this army of more than 100,000 soldiers with expert precision. "Stop!" he murmured. The shadow soldiers immediately paused. Jin-Woo addressed the being next to him, who was also observing the mock battle. "What do you think?" Grand Marshal Bellion was impressed. "I had never thought of maneuvering soldiers in this way. That was quite amazing, my lord." Bellion had stood on countless battlefields alongside the previous Shadow Monarch, but he had never seen an army commanded in such a manner. He was most awestruck by Jin-Woo's strategy of recalling and summoning soldiers. Igris straightened up proudly, accustomed to this style of battle, since he had been by Jin-Woo's side for some time. Jin-Woo couldn't help but chuckle at the night. Just then, his phone vibrated. "Boss, it's me, Jin-Ho." "Oh, hey." According to Jin-Ho, the Ajin Guild had been inundated with as many calls as the association following Jin-Woo's vanishing act, making it impossible to use the company phones. "Sorry about that. I just need some time to gather my thoughts." "No need to apologize, boss. The Ajin Guild's whole purpose has been to allow you to focus on raids without dealing with this kind of thing, right?" As Jin-Ho laughed, Jin-Woo smiled in return. "Oh, right. Have you contacted your family yet? I told them that I'd come home after I've had a chance to clear my head. That should be some relief to them." "That's good, boss." Jin-Woo let out a heavy sigh as he tucked away his phone. He knew he couldn't avoid things for too long, but if he talked about the shadow soldiers and the gate, he'd have to explain rulers and monarchs. How should he go about telling everyone that Earth was soon to be the battleground for the armies of the warring rulers and monarchs, and armies were going to spill out of the 8 remaining gates? Jin-Woo had to flee to get a chance to think things through. This was the best he could do. He wanted to let them enjoy their blissful ignorance for just a bit longer. "I'm sure it'll be okay to put it off for a few days." As soon as he came to this conclusion, Baru approached. He had been uncharacteristically quiet this whole time. "My king." "Yeah." Jin-Woo turned to see Baru on his knees with his head bowed. "Please allow me to be tested for the rank of Grand Marshal." "Grand Marshal?" Didn't Jin-Woo already have a Grand Marshal? Jin-Woo suddenly remembered what the system had said about the Marshal rank. Does he mean? Sure enough, Baru looked up and declared, "I, Marshal Baru, would like to challenge Grand Marshal Bellion." Baru was referring to something the system had mentioned before its deletion. There could be only one leader of the army. If more than one soldier reached the Marshal rank, a hierarchy had to be decided among them. Since Baru had recently become a marshal, Jin-Woo assumed that he had the right to challenge the Grand Marshal. Just like it was with anti-magic beasts, Baru wanted to make the hierarchy of the colony clear. A fight between marshals. Jin-Woo raised an eyebrow at the other marshal, Igris, but Igris politely declined to get involved. The knight wasn't interested in jockeying for position among the marshals. When Igris stepped back, Jinwoo's gaze fell on Bellion, who had been standing next to him. As the commander of 130,000 shadow soldiers, the only one who could overrule Bellion was Jin-Woo himself. Bellion met Jinwoo's eyes and lowered his head, but even like that, He was still a good head taller than Thomas Andre. Bellion softly replied, "As you wish, master." As he wished, huh? Jin-Woo snorted with laughter at his response. Bellion's answer had been worded politely, but what that meant was that he would accept any challenge as long as his master approved. Jin-Woo glanced over his shoulder to see Baru with claws out, raring to go at Bellion's acceptance. Scraya! Unlike Bellion, who was concealing his magic power as best as he could, Baru didn't bother holding back. Jin-Woo considered it. Fine. Jin-Woo knew Baru well, but he had no information regarding Bellion. Any insight into Bellion's combat power would help him better command the Shadow Army. There was no reason to disallow the showdown. However, the fight will end when I say it does. With permission granted, Baru's eyes sparkled. He passionately cried, "You have the eternal gratitude of this humble sire. Don't. Just don't. Thank you, my king." In the meantime, Bellion calmly prepared for the fight. First, there was something Jin-Woo had to check on before letting them run wild. He summoned one of the Kamish Wrath daggers, poured some of his aura into it, and gently swung it toward the forest. Crack. Black energy was sent hurtling through the forest, wiping out a section of trees. However, the damage wasn't as much as Jin-Woo had expected. He nodded and returned the dagger. This should do. The fight between the two marshals wouldn't cause any unnecessary damage to the area. The land had been strengthened with concentrated mana and was suitable as a battlefield. Jin-Woo briefly frowned at that fact. Then he looked back up at the two combatants. He had high hopes for this match. All right, then. The Grand Marshal and the new Marshal both nodded at him and waited for his signal. Give us your command. I humbly await your order, my king. Jin-Woo grinned. Take your places. Though the actual emergency was resolved, the emergency response meeting room of the Hunters Association of Korea was even busier now. The foreign press is demanding an official statement. The Hunter Command Center in the United States is asking us to share Hunter Sung's location. Seoul Metropolitan Fire and Disaster Headquarters want to know when the evacuees can return. The Jimmy Show from the Hunter Channel wants to interview Hunter Sung. Tell Timmy or Jimmy or whoever to try and reach Hunter Sung himself. Fortunately, despite the flood of calls, the phone lines were still operational. President Wu sighed heavily as the tower of paperwork on his desk continued to grow, even though he'd been giving out orders all day. He had a mountain of things to do. Or by this point, it was more like a mountain range. It was enough to send an A-rank hunter's head spinning. As he shook his head to try and rouse his tired body, he overheard one of his subordinates say something he just couldn't let slide. Ugh, did Hunter Sung's minions have to use that gate? The subordinate's grousing snapped him to attention. Would you prefer that they were magic beasts instead, someone? Pardon, sir? That's not what I... Someone was too flustered to reply. Jinchul chided him. What if all these calls you had to answer were coming from the families of deceased hunters instead of the media? Would you be able to grumble about work then? Someone could not look Jinchul in the eye. Only those employees with field experience could fully understand what hunters went through in emergency situations. They had no idea what kinds of things happened within the depths of the dungeons away from prying eyes. Considering the many different ways the raid on the monolithic gate could have gone south, yesterday's outcome was much more preferable. More than 100,000 magic beasts had emerged with no injuries or destruction, and the magic beasts had been absorbed into Jin-Woo's army. Who could have predicted that? It was beyond anyone's wildest dreams. But it was thanks to the peaceful outcome that Jinchul was able to cope with all the work he had to do around the clock these past few days with a smile. So for a Hunters Association employee to be complaining just because he felt tired was utterly ridiculous. If Jin-Woo was around, Jin-Chul might even have hit someone over the head before Jin-Woo had a chance to get mad, because he understood where Jin-Woo was coming from. Jin-Chul stopped his employees for a minute. I understand very well that you may be freaking out because Hunter Sung has disappeared. But for a hunter who took his responsibilities seriously to up and vanish meant that he had his reasons. Hunter Sung is probably more shocked than the rest of us. With great power comes great responsibility, or so Jin-Chul had once heard in a movie. It was an apt way to describe the weight of the burden on Jin-Woo's shoulders. I've known Hunter Sung for some time now, but I've never seen him this stressed out before. It looked like Jin-Woo wasn't sure what to expect next. He'd been prepared to sacrifice his life to defend a dungeon break, but instead, the magic beasts had pledged their allegiance to him. Who could blame him for being so confused? The Hunters Association's duty at this time was to empathize and endure this hardship with him until he returned and explained everything to them. The association was first and foremost a dependable bulwark for their hunters. If we at the Hunters Association can't understand what Hunter Sung is going through, then who can? As they listened to the president's impassioned speech, the employees forgot how tired they were, their eyes stinging with unshed tears. Someone hung his head. I'm sorry, sir. I wasn't thinking straight. I'm so sorry. Jin-Chul gently patted his employee on the shoulder and let him return to work. Jin-Chul sat back down with a heavy sigh. The pile of documents on his desk seemed to have doubled in the short time he'd been talking. Though he stared at the mountain of paperwork, his thoughts were with Jin-Woo. What is Hunter Sung doing now? Jin-Woo looked delighted as he put some distance between him and the two marshals. Igris took a place next to him, and the other shadow soldiers spread out to form a huge circle with enough room for the two fighters to move around. Scraw! From opposite ends of the circle, Baru fully extended his claws and let out a screech as Bellion quietly unsheathed his sword from his waist. At first glance, Bellion appeared to be a swordsman like Igris. Oh! Jin-Woo's eyes fixed on Bellion's unique sword. Can you even call that a sword? The blade was made up of dozens of joints, not unlike a centipede. The marshals finished their preparations and turned to Jin-Woo at the same time. Begin! On Jin-Woo's command, Baru immediately charged at his opponent. Scream! Baru approached Bellion at an incredible clip and swiped at him. Bellion dodged the attack and spun around to face Baru's back as the ant shot past him. Jin-Woo could only stare as Bellion's sword began to stretch like a snake and aimed for Baru. Swoosh! As Baru hurriedly changed directions, he reflexively batted the sword away. Clang! And so the battle began in earnest. Bellion used his sword like a whip and launched a veritable storm of slashes. The concentrated mana in the sword swirled freely through the air, raising the land around Baru. HWP. 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 Merely blocking Bellion's attacks kept Baru busy. Scraw! Jin-Woo watched Bellion's innovative use of the sword and imagined himself facing Bellion as an opponent. Time slowed down for him, but even in this mode, Bellion's sword was quick enough to present a danger. Jin-Woo narrowed his eyes as he tracked the movements of the unpredictable sword. Upper left, right side, upper left again, then lower left and upper right. In his mind's eye, he dodged all the attacks and got in front of Bellion. He then lopped off Bellion's head. He could have accomplished all that in the blink of an eye. A chill ran up Bellion's spine, and he hurriedly looked over his shoulder. Whoops! Jin-Woo had been focused too intensely on the never-before-seen weapon. He met the eyes of the flustered Bellion and shot him an apologetic look. Baru did not pass up the opportunity. He knocked away Bellion's sword and streaked toward him like a bolt of lightning. Scree! Shhhk. However, it was Bellion who thrust his weapon into his opponent's stomach to Jin-Woo's surprise. Bellion's reflexes were well beyond Jin-Woo's expectations. In addition, he possessed an awesome destructive power that could split the ground with a single strike. Bellion was, without a doubt, a soldier worthy of the Grand Marshal rank. Still, he shouldn't let his guard down. An insect's greatest attribute was its tenacity, and sure enough, Baru expanded his body with the sword still stuck in his stomach. He swung down his enlarged fist on his opponent's head. Wham! The impact was so great that part of Bellion's helmet broke off, releasing black smoke into the air. Scree! Baru slammed his fist down a second time, or at least he tried to. Bellion managed to grab Baru's wrist. Baru attempted to shake off Bellion's grip, but Bellion wouldn't budge. Meanwhile, the knight pulled back his other arm and focused a large amount of mana on it. Then, whack! Bellion punched Baru in the chest, sending the ant flying backward. The resulting shock wave ripped the surrounding trees out from their roots. The forest that was once thick with trees now had a clear path through it. Screa! Baru came to a halt by spreading his wings, but he could do little else before Bellion appeared right in front of him. Bellion hammered him from above and sent him hurtling toward the ground. Wud! Baru crashed into the ground like a meteor. Bellion followed close behind, and despite the impact, Baru jumped to his feet and fought back. Any other enemy would have been ripped apart by this point. Shhhk. Baru swung his claws at Bellion, who deflected them with a backhand and struck Baru in the head. Bam! What followed was a total slugfest. Pow! Kapow! Pow! Pow! Baru's strikes were only able to make Bellion lose his balance momentarily. Kaboom! On the other hand, Bellion's attacks contained enough power to kill any other person. Creak crock! Baru's exoskeleton cracked as if it would soon come apart. Scraw! Baru fought tooth and nail to the end. When he attempted to bite Bellion on the shoulder, Bellion grabbed him by the neck. Crack! Immobilized, Baru thrashed in Bellion's grip. Bellion concentrated a tremendous amount of mana in his other arm for his ultimate attack. It would be enough to crush a dragon's head with one blow, and it distorted the air around them. The victor was clear. Bellion's fist flew toward Baru's face. Not wanting to see Baru lose his head, Jin-Woo took hold of Bellion's fist. Enough! Bellion instantly withdrew, then dropped to one knee and bowed his head. My king! Well done! Jin-Woo's eyes twinkled with praise for Bellion, for the display of his abilities that held nothing back. He then approached Baru's splade on the ground. Scree! My king, I scraw! I can still fight! Jin-Woo looked down at the pitiable ant struggling to stand. Baru, why are you so determined to become Grand Marshal? I wish to stay by your side forever, Baru sorrowfully explained. Jin-Woo scratched his head. The Grand Marshal will be my right hand, and you can be my left. Baru's eyes widened at Jin-Woo's declaration. My liege, don't! Jin-Woo sighed at the emotional Ant King, then looked up as another soldier approached. It was Igris, who had been listening in on their conversation. My king, please allow me the opportunity to also issue a chow. Jin-Woo interrupted him as if he had been expecting this. And you can have my back. Igris had nothing else to say at his master's foresight. I see. So the Shadow Monarch has become our enemy. The Dragon King, currently in human form, calmly received the report from the monarchs already on Earth. In this darkness, the only thing he could hear were their voices. "I understand. I will take care of him. Do not do anything. We must not sustain any more losses." The Dragon King ended the connection after fully understanding the situation. Silence fell. The gap between dimensions was a world in which nothing existed. Filled with emptiness, it was held to the monarchs, since there was nothing to destroy. Born for the purpose of destroying everything in existence, the monarch of destruction had been making every effort to escape this place. And finally, his efforts would bear fruit. The Dragon King turned and relayed an order to the creatures in the darkness. "Prepare for war, my soldiers." Dozens of ancient dragons, hundreds of dragon soldiers, and tens of thousands of dragon folk hiding in the darkness roared, their eyes glittering. "Raya?" Late at night, Jin-Woo sat comfortably atop a high hill. Under the bright moonlight, he could see the forest clear as day. He had given his shadow soldiers some free time, so they had spread out in the area below him. The large frame of Fong and the dragons caught his eye. After talking with Fong, the dragons appeared to be engrossed in a serious conversation. Eventually, the largest of the dragons approached Fong. "What are those guys up to?" The other soldiers around them ran to get some distance from the four figures. Soon after, the big dragon shot fire into the sky. "Plum!" Seeing the size of his flames, Fong sneered and took a step forward. "Plum!" An incredibly huge pillar of fire shot out of Fong's mouth and lit up the night sky. The high orcs cheered and whistled triumphantly, and the big dragon hung his head. It seemed they had made a bet about whose firepower was the greatest. But isn't it cheating to use the sphere of avarice? Fong had been surreptitiously tucking the sphere away inside his clothes, but froze and smiled awkwardly when he made eye contact with Jin-Woo. Jin-Woo burst out laughing at Fong's gall, but waved his hand to let him know it was fine. Fong grinned and bowed several times in gratitude. It was peaceful. But although Jin-Woo wore a tranquil expression, his mind was in turmoil. He looked up at the sky. Jin-Woo could faintly sense the life forms from a different world growing ever closer. Their maliciousness and power prickled Jin-Woo's mind, though they felt like trying to make out a blurry object through heavy fog. Who knows when they'll make their move? Jin-Woo's heart was heavy with the fact that there was no way to avoid the coming confrontation. He was lost in his thoughts for a while before he looked up again. He spotted something strange and peered closer to see ant soldiers diligently carrying off lumber and stones. What are they doing now? Before Jin-Woo could summon Baru to ask, a voice came from behind him. "It appears they wish to build a small shelter for you to rest comfortably while we are here, my liege." It was a soft voice that didn't suit the large frame of Grandmaster Bellion. Jin-Woo nodded as he watched the ants at work. "I'm guessing this is Baru's doing." The only marshal who quickly and passionately set out to do something Jin-Woo hadn't requested of him was Baru. On the other hand, Igris was the type to flawlessly carry out everything Jin-Woo asked of him. And Bellion. Bellion was still a mystery, as Jin-Woo didn't know that much about him yet. The strong bond connecting Jin-Woo to Bellion had been forged with the previous Shadow Monarch. Jin-Woo wanted to get to know his Grand Marshal. Bellion seemed to have read his mind. The knight drew closer and stood right behind him. "My king, why do you not call back your shadow soldiers?" Jin-Woo continued to watch the soldiers. "I don't want them to feel imprisoned. They were stuck in the gap between dimensions before arriving here, after all." Not expecting that response, Bellion didn't say anything for a time. Jin-Woo asked him something in turn. "Aren't you sad that you can no longer see Ashbourne, the previous Shadow Monarch?" Having lost his father, Jin-Woo knew the pain of losing someone important. He assumed Bellion would feel the same way. "I stood by his side, when he tried to stop the rulers in the rebellion against the Supreme Being. When he acquired power over the dead, I was the first to volunteer to be his soldier. Bellion's voice was steady. I assisted him for nearly an eternity, and I never once questioned his decision. That doesn't answer my question, though. Jin-Woo repeated his initial question. However, Bellion didn't know how to answer him. I have never thought about my feelings. That's why I've given you an opportunity to think about them. There was a long and heavy silence, and in it, Jin-Woo felt Bellion's sincerity. Words hadn't been spoken, but they'd still been communicated. Jin-Woo finally turned to look at him. I'd like to hear the story of you and Ashbourne, if that's okay with you. It is a long story. Good. I need a story long enough to listen to until I fall asleep. As Jin-Woo looked straight ahead again, Bellion took a seat next to him. The story begins when I was still but a fruit in the world tree. A fruit? You used to be a fruit? Every soldier of the sky is born as a fruit on a branch of the world tree. The tree is enormous, and its branches cover the entire sky. You don't say. The night wore on as Jin-Woo listened to Bellion recount the epic story of the Shadow Monarch. The sun hadn't risen yet as Jin-Woo slowly ran through the forest. He'd gotten in the habit of running 10 kilometers a day, so even though he no longer had any daily quests, it came naturally to him. While breathing in the fresh morning air, Jin-Woo had almost finished working everything out in his mind. It's time I head back. He needed to inform people about the 8 approaching armies that would arrive in the near future. He needed to let everyone know that war was coming. Jin-Woo could not promise everyone's safety or that the world would ever be the same. The Dragon King that he'd seen in the Shadow Monarch's memories was just that powerful. The Monarch of Destruction and the army he commanded turned everything before them to ash. And their next target was Earth. That was why Jin-Woo needed to give everyone, including himself, time to prepare. He stopped running after exactly 10 kilometers, even without the system to prompt him. Since he had done the daily quest almost every day without fail, he had maintained that muscle memory. Of course, good habits weren't the only thing that his body had memorized. He had learned through many fights and gained much power as a result. The previous Shadow Monarch had wanted to rest, and the last gift he had given Jin-Woo was a fighting chance against the oncoming disaster. Jin-Woo changed direction and headed toward the sun rising over the ridge of a far-off mountain. Now able to use Shadow Exchange freely, Jin-Woo teleported to the Ajin Guild headquarters. He materialized outside the office because he didn't want to give anyone a heart attack, but he ended up running into a woman he didn't recognize anyway. Although he didn't know her, she did look somewhat familiar. The woman must have also had the same thought about him, as she spun toward him and called out, excuse me." Jin-Woo wordlessly waited for her to continue. However, she seemed startled by something, and she muttered that it was nothing and quickly sped away. How weird. Jin-Woo entered the office. Huh? What? The office workers froze in their tracks with disbelief on their faces. Should I have said hi while walking in? If people were going to react like this anyway, there had been no point in appearing outside the office. Even before he could pointedly ask if that was how guild employees should be greeting their president, Jin-Ho saw him and gleefully darted toward him. "Boss!" Jin-Woo immediately asked about the strange woman. "Who's that person who just left the office?" "Oh, that was my older sister. She showed up here because I've been ignoring her phone calls." "Wait, was she rude to you or something?" "No, not at all." Well, that explained it. She had looked familiar because she was related to Jin-Ho. He glanced at the door and nodded. "So what did she want?" "Oh." Jin-Ho hesitated and then peeked at Jin-Woo's reaction. "You know how I was with you before the massive gate opened?" "Yeah. Apparently I was caught on tape, boss." Jin-Woo understood the gist of what he was about to say. "My family wants me to turn in my hunter's license and stop going to dangerous places now that I'm the vice president of the Jin Guild." Since Jin-Woo, the guild master, was a hunter, Jin-Ho, the vice guild master, didn't necessarily need to be a hunter. His worried family members certainly had a point. Regardless, Jin-Woo didn't try to persuade Jin-Ho either way, because he knew the younger man very well. Jin-Ho probably wants to accompany me as a hunter until the very end. Although Jin-Woo did all the heavy lifting, the two of them had been through life and death situations together. Feeling proud of Jin-Ho, he reached out and ruffled his hair. "Be boss?" Jin-Woo left Jin-Ho flustered and went into the president's office. He took off the clothes he had been wearing for a few days now, changed into new ones, and walked back out. "I'm going to use the van." "Huh? Do you want me to drive, boss?" "No, I'll be right back." "Where are you going?" "To the Hunters Association." As Jin-Woo took the key and headed out, Jin-Ho hurried to stop him. "Wait, boss! There are reporters." But before he could tell Jin-Woo about the journalists camped outside, the S-rank hunter was already gone. Sure enough, outside the building, reporters hoping for a big scoop were waiting for Jin-Woo. Not having slept or eaten in days, they looked like zombies. Their response to seeing Jin-Woo in person was explosive. "Hunter Sung! It's Hunter Sung! Hunter Sung is here! You're filming this, right?" Their voices died down quickly. "Huh? WH what?" The perplexed reporters couldn't believe what was happening. They looked down and realized that they and everything around them were floating about 10 centimeters off the ground. "How is this?" Fortunately, this strange phenomenon passed quickly. "Oh!" By the time the reporters returned to the ground, Jin-Woo was already gone. They exchanged looks of panic, then burst out laughing. "Ha ha!" Well, they had nothing else to say. This was just one more thing to add in their articles about Hunter Sung. Jin-Woo drove Bungdo directly to the Hunters Association. Having already called ahead, he was met by President Woo and his entourage. However, what's going on? The association employees had ominous looks on their faces. President Woo hurriedly approached Jin-Woo as he got out of the van. His voice was shaky, but he tried to sound calm. "Hunter Sung, have you heard the news?"